God and the State. None know all this better than our illustrious contemporary idealists. They are learned men who know history by heart, and as they are at the same time living men, great souls penetrated with a sincere and profound love for the welfare of humanity, they have cursed and branded all these misdeeds, all these crimes of religion, with an eloquence unparalleled. They reject with indignation all solidarity with the God of positive religions and with his representatives, past, present, and on earth. And let's distinguish between religion and church, and also point out that it's talking about toxic positivity, right? Things aren't all positive. Good and evil isn't positive versus negative. The God whom they adore, or whom they think they adore, is distinguished from the real gods of history precisely in this, that he is not at all a positive God defined in any way whatever, theologically or even metaphysically. He is neither the supreme being of Robespierre and J.J. Rousseau, nor the pantheistic God of Spinoza, nor even the at once immanent, transcendental, and very equivocal God of Hegel. They take good care not to give him any positive definition whatever, feeling very strongly that any definition would subject him to the dissolving power of criticism. They will not say whether he is a personal or impersonal God, whether he created or did not create the world. They will not even speak of his divine providence, all that might compromise him. They content themselves with their saying God and nothing more. But then, what is their God? Not even an idea. It is an aspiration. It is the generic name of all that seems grand, good, beautiful, noble, human to them. Hence, the problems with some of the ideas about deity that people have is, what if God was one of us was a song when I was younger. But why then do they not say man? Ah, because King William of Prussia and Napoleon III and all their compeers are likewise men, which bothers them very much. Real humanity presents a mixture of all that is most sublime and beautiful with all that is vilest and monstrous in the world. And even more so than those things without choice, right? Because humans can choose one way or another, in a moral sense at the very least. How do they get over this? Why, they call one divine and the other bestial, representing divinity and animality as two poles, between which they place humanity. They either will not or cannot understand that these three terms are really but one, and that to separate them is to destroy them. Well, a person can think of different qualities and all that sort of stuff. Well, it would destroy the Christian doctrine because, Jesus is fully human and fully divine at the same time, according to the Christian doctrine. They are not strong on logic, and one might say that they despise it. That is what distinguishes them from the pantheistical and deistical metaphysicians and gives their ideas the character of a practical idealism, drawing its inspiration much less from the severe development of a thought than from the experiences, I might almost say the emotions, historical and collective as well as individual, of life. This gives their propaganda an appearance of wealth and vital power, but an appearance only, for life itself becomes sterile when paralyzed by a logical contradiction. This contradiction lies here. They wish God, and they wish humanity. They persist in connecting two terms which, once separated, can come together again only to destroy each other. They say, in a single breath, God and the liberty of man, God and the dignity, justice, equality, fraternity, prosperity of men, regardless of the fatal logic by virtue of which, if God exists, all these things are condemned to non-existence. For if God is, he is necessarily the eternal, supreme, absolute master, and if such a master exists, man is a slave. And now if he is a slave, neither justice, nor equality, nor fraternity, nor prosperity are possible for him. In vain, flying in the face of good sense and all the teachings of history, do they represent their God as animated by the tenderest love of human liberty, a master, whoever he may be, and however liberal he may desire to show himself, remains nonetheless always a master. His existence necessarily implies the slavery of all that is beneath him. Therefore, if God existed, only in one way could he serve human liberty, by ceasing to exist. Well, it depends. Do you lift the bonds and chains, or do you hold them on? And is it best for life, or is it not best for life? A jealous lover of human liberty, and deeming it the absolute condition of all that we admire and respect in humanity, I reverse the phrase of Voltaire and say that if God really existed, it would be necessary to abolish him. The severe logic that dictates these words is far too evident to require a development of this argument, and it seems to me impossible that the illustrious men whose names so celebrated and so justly respected I have cited should not have been struck by it themselves, and should not have perceived the contradiction in which they involved themselves in speaking of God and human liberty at once. To have disregarded it, they must have considered this inconsistency our logical license practically necessary to humanity's well-being. Perhaps, too, while speaking of liberty as something very respectable and very dear in their eyes, they give the term a meaning quite different from the conception entertained by us, materialists and revolutionary socialists. And revolutionary in the way of, if it's needed to make a change, right? Indeed, they never speak of it without immediately adding another word, authority, a word and a thing which we detest with all our heart. And an ancient Egyptian who meant the authority. Twisted rope, little chick there, and a seated dude, which is the ideogram of deity. I'm not saying this has anything to do with ancient Egypt, but you know what I mean. What is authority? It is the inevitable power of the natural laws which manifest themselves in the necessary concatenation and succession of phenomena in the physical and social worlds, and we'd call that the Chot body. Again, using the ancient Egyptian. Indeed, against these laws, revolt is not only forbidden, it is even impossible. We may misunderstand them, or not know them at all, but we cannot disobey them, because they constitute the basis and fundamental conditions of our existence. They envelop us, penetrate us, regulate all our movements, thoughts, and acts, even when we believe that we disobey them. We only show their omnipotence. Yes, we are absolutely the slaves of these laws, but in such slavery there is no humiliation, or rather, it is not slavery at all, for slavery supposes an external master, a legislator outside of him whom he commands. While these laws are not outside of us, they are inherent in us. Hence the chains on the devil card, in such a way that a person can get out, or they can crawl out of the sphere, and they constitute our being, our whole being, physically, intellectually, and morally. We live, we breathe, we act, we think, we wish only through these laws. Without them, we are nothing, we are not. Whence, then, could we derive the power and the wish to rebel against them? In his relation to natural laws, but one liberty is possible to man, that of recognizing and applying them on an ever-extending scale, in conformity with the object of collective and individual emancipation, or humanization, which he pursues. These laws, once recognized, exercise an authority which is never disputed by the mass of men. One must, for instance, be at bottom either a fool or a theologian, or at least a metaphysician, jurist, or bourgeoisie economist, to rebel against the law by which twice two make four. One must have faith to imagine that fire will not burn nor water drown. Now, what if a being was to come and their fire was water and their water was fire, and their good food was bad food and their garbage was good food, and ointment and medicine, whatever, except indeed recourse be had to some subterfuge founded in its turn on some other natural law. But these revolts, or rather these attempts at, or foolish fancies of an impossible revolt, are decidedly the exception. For in general, it may be said that the mass of men in their daily lives acknowledge the government of common sense, and that is, of the sum of the natural laws generally recognized in an almost absolute fashion. The great misfortune is that a large number of natural laws already established as such by science remain unknown to the masses, thanks to the watchfulness of these tutelary governments that exist. As we know only for the good of the people, there is another difficulty, namely that the major portion of the natural laws connected with the development of human society, which are quite as necessary, invariable, fatal as the laws that govern the physical world, have not been duly established and recognized by science itself. Once they shall have been recognized by science, and then from science, by means of an extensive system of popular education and instruction, shall have passed into the consciousness of all. The question of liberty will be entirely solved. The most stubborn authorities must admit then that there will be no need either of political organization or direction or legislation. Three things which, whether they emanate from the will of the sovereign or from the vote of a parliament elected by universal suffrage, and even should they conform to the system of natural laws, which has never been the case and never will be the case, are always equally fatal and hostile to the liberty of the masses, from the very fact that they impose upon them a system of external and therefore despotic laws. You know, it's like now the censorship and cancel culture and all that stuff. You know, they say we want freedom, and then they insert worse, right? The liberty of man consists solely in this, that he obeys natural laws because he has himself recognized them as such, and not because they have been externally imposed upon him by any extrinsic will, whatever, divine or human, collective or individual. Suppose a learned academy composed of the most illustrious representatives of science. Suppose this academy, charged with legislation for and the organization of society, and that, inspired only by the purest love of truth, it frames none but laws in absolute harmony with the latest discoveries of science. Well, we need to be careful with too many laws or whatever, or like what happens in my country, that they can't ban the harmful drugs or whatever because they don't, like Islam says, you know, no intoxicants except as needed to survive, right? And some communities would be allowed to do that because of their religious freedom and stuff like that, but you know, it doesn't need to be specifically listed out. But in modern governments it does. So all you need to do is engineer a drug a little bit over here, and a bunch of people work on it, and somebody can engineer a drug that's as effective, but it's completely legal. There's other examples, but well, I maintain for my part that such legislation and such organization would be a monstrosity, and that for two reasons. First, that human science is always and necessarily imperfect, and that comparing what it has discovered with what remains to be discovered, we may say that it is still in its cradle, so that we were to try to force the practical the practical life of men, collective as well as individual, into strict and exclusive conformity with the latest data of science. We should condemn society, as well as individuals, to suffer martyrdom on a bed of Procrustes, which would soon end by dislocating and stifling them. Life ever remaining an infinitely greater thing than science. And one of the things about Islamic law is it's not something that's enforced for the most part, even when it's how the government runs. Because, this is personal life, right? Religious stuff in particular, the government doesn't enforce it. But the secularists, they enforce their ideas of right and wrong and what's popular and all that. The second reason is this: a society which should obey legislation emanating from the scientific academy, not because it understood itself the rational character of this legislation, in which case the existence of the academy would become useless, but because this legislation emanating from the academy was imposed in the name of a science which it venerated without comprehending. Such a society would be a society not of men but of brutes. It would be a second edition of those missions in Paraguay which submitted so long to the government of the Jesuits. It would surely and rapidly descend to the lowest stage of idiocy. But there is still a third reason which would render such a government impossible, namely that a scientific academy invested with a sovereignty, so to speak, absolute, even if it were composed of the most illustrious men, would infallibly and soon end its own moral and intellectual corruption. Well, also, how do you pass laws based on science? Because science is the animals do stuff, and, there's nothing coming in from the outside and saying, "Are you lying? How dare you?" Some people may hunt lions, but you know what I mean. Even today, with the few privileges allowed them, such is the history of all academies. The greatest scientific genius, from the moment that he becomes an academician, okay, an officially licensed savant, eventually lapses into sluggishness. He loses his spontaneity, his revolutionary hardihood, and that troublesome and savage energy characteristic of the grandest geniuses ever called to destroy old tottering worlds and lay the foundations of new. He undoubtedly gains in politeness, in utilitarian and practical wisdom, what he loses in power of thought. In a word, he becomes corrupted. It is the characteristic of privilege and of every privileged person to kill the mind and heart of men. The privileged man, whether politically or economically, is a man depraved in mind and heart. That is a social law which admits of no exception, and is as applicable to entire nations as to classes, corporations, and individuals. It is the law of equality, the supreme condition of liberty and humanity. The principal object of this treatise is precisely to demonstrate this truth in all the manifestations of human life. A scientific body to which has been confided the government of society would soon end by devoting itself no longer to science at all, but to quite another affair, and that affair, as in the case of all established powers, would be its own eternal perpetuation, by rendering the society confided to its care ever more stupid, and consequently more in need of its government and direction. And in my country we see that too, is that they'll make the situation worse and give people a little bit, and that, I'm talking about the stimuluses. Even the lowest members of society would have been better off if all that was skipped, and but instead prices soar, quality goes down, availability goes down, and They throw in some stimuluses, to kind of fool people a little bit, but pretty much everybody can see they're worse off, right? But that which is true of scientific academies is also true of all constituent and legislative assemblies, even those chosen by universal suffrage. In the latter case, they may renew their composition, it is true, but this does not prevent the formation, in a few years' time, of a body of politicians, privileged in fact, though not in law, who, devoting themselves exclusively to the direction of the public affairs of a country, finally form a sort of political aristocracy, or oligarchy. Witness the United States of America and Switzerland. Consequently, no external legislation and no authority, one, for that matter, being inseparable from the other, and both tending to the servitude of society and the degradation of the legislators themselves. Does it follow that I reject all authority? Far from me such a thought. In the matter of boots, I refer to the authority of the bootmaker. Concerning houses, canals, or railroads, I consult that of the architect or engineer. For such or such special knowledge, I apply to such or such a savant. But I allow neither the bootmaker, nor the architect, nor the savant to impose his authority upon me. I listen to them freely, and with all the respect merited by their intelligence, their character, their knowledge, reserving always my incontestable right of criticism and censure. And see, when you do the latter, it doesn't mean you're saying you know more. It's saying that, well, I don't know if I agree with your conclusion based on what you've told me, right? Or there's other information than they mentioned. It's like, that's why you get that one device for your car, because you want to know for yourself. They'll know how to fix it better, but, if you can verify what they're saying, it, helps the situation instead of not knowing. I don't know, I'll spend another hundreds of dollars more to have my car fixed. Was it needed? I do not content myself with consulting a single authority in any special branch. I consult several. I compare their opinions and choose that which seems to me the soundest. But I recognize no infallible authority, even in special questions. Consequently, whatever respect I may have for the honesty and the sincerity of such or such an individual, I have no absolute faith in any person. Such a faith would be fatal to my reason, to my liberty, and even to the success of my undertakings. It would immediately transform me into a stupid slave, an instrument of the will and interests of others. If I bow before the authority of the specialist, and avow my readiness to follow, to a certain extent, and as long as may seem to me necessary, their indications and even their directions, it is because their authority is imposed upon me by no one, neither by men nor by God. Otherwise, I would repel them with horror, and bid the devil take their counsels, their directions, their services, certain that they would make me pay by the loss of my liberty and self-respect for such scraps of truth wrapped in a multitude of lies as they might give me. And yeah, if people are unquestioned, you never know what's going to happen. Even, outside of the Islamic world, who was there to question, is this even the recitation of scripture? If they got it wrong, well, the mistakes would get passed on because no one was allowed to correct them, publicly or even privately, in a lot of cases. And, if that can happen, some intentional stuff can slip in. Got to be worried about people who take, it's like, oh, well, just trust us when we give lectures on our conclusions. It's like, why can't we have the books in the house of worship that lead to those conclusions? I bow before the authority of special men because it is imposed upon me by my own reason. I am conscious of my inability to grasp, in all its details and positive developments, any very large portion of the human knowledge. The greatest intelligence would not be equal to a comprehension of the whole. Thence results for science as well as for industry the necessity of the division and association of labor. I receive and I give. Such is human life. Such directs and is directed in his turn. Therefore, there is no fixed and constant authority, but a continual exchange of mutual, temporary, and above all, voluntary authority and subordination. The same reason forbids me, then, to recognize a fixed, constant, and universal authority, because there is no universal man, no man capable of grasping in that wealth of detail, without which the application of science to life is impossible. All the sciences, all the branches of social life, and if such universality could ever be realized in a single man, and if he wished to take advantage thereof, to impose his authority upon us, it would be necessary to drive this man out of society, because his authority would inevitably reduce all the others to slavery and imbecility. I do not think that society ought to maltreat men of genius, as it has done hitherto, but neither do I think it should indulge them too far, still less accord them any privileges or exclusive rights whatsoever. And that for three reasons. First, because it would often mistake a charlatan for a man of genius. Second, because through such a system of privileges it might transform into a charlatan even a real man of genius, demoralize him, and degrade him. And finally, because it would establish a master over itself. Sometimes people may wonder why they don't have certain means. And maybe that popularity, that money, that physical ability or appearance or companionship or whatever, if that was there, you wouldn't make the right decisions with it. To sum up, we recognize then the absolute authority of science, because the sole object of science is the mental reproduction, as well considered and systematic as possible, of the natural laws inherent in the material, intellectual, and moral life of both the physical and the social worlds, these two worlds constituting in fact but one and the same natural world. Outside of this, only legitimate authority, legitimate because rational and in harmony with human liberty, we declare all other authorities false, arbitrary, and fatal. We recognize the absolute authority of science, but we reject the infallibility and universality of the savant. In our church, if I may be permitted to use for a moment an expression which I so detest, well, because if you're going to honor the hero, perhaps there's a way to honor the hero. Church and state are my two betis noros. In our church, as in the Protestant church, we have a chief, an invisible Christ, science. And like the Protestants, more logical even than the Protestants, we will suffer neither pope, nor council, nor conclaves of infallible cardinals, nor bishops, nor even priests. Our Christ differs from the Protestant and Christian church in this, that the latter Christ is a personal being, ours impersonal. The Christian Christ, already completed in an eternal past, presents himself as a perfect being, while the completion and perfection of our Christ, science, are ever in the future, which is equivalent to saying that they will never be realized. Therefore, in recognizing absolute science as the only absolute authority, we in no way compromise our liberty. I mean by the words absolute science, the truly universal science, which would reproduce ideally to its fullest extent and in all its infinite detail the universe, the system or coordination of all the natural laws manifested by the incessant development of the world. It is evident that such a science, the sublime object of all the efforts of the human mind, will never be fully and absolutely realized. Our Christ, then, will remain eternally unfinished, which must considerably take down the pride of his licensed representatives among us. Against that, God, the Son, in whose name they assume to impose upon us their insolent and pedantic authority, we appeal to God the Father, who is the real world, real life, of which He, the Son, is only a too imperfect expression, whilst we real beings, living, working, struggling, loving, aspiring, enjoying, and suffering, are its immediate representatives. But while rejecting the absolute, universal, and infallible authority of men of science, we willingly bow before the respectable, although relative, quite temporary, and very restricted authority of the representatives of special sciences, asking nothing better than to consult them by turns, and very grateful for such precious information as they may extend to us, on condition of their willingness to receive from us on occasions when, and concerning matters about which we are more learned than they. And Muhammad said to the people that you are more learned about worldly matters. He wasn't coming with a doctrine to conflict with worldly matters. He just, if people are going to graft trees or whatever, In general, we ask nothing better than to see men endowed with great knowledge, great experience, great minds, and above all, great hearts, exercise over us a natural and legitimate influence, freely accepted, and never imposed in the name of any official authority whatsoever, celestial or terrestrial. We accept all natural authorities, and all influences of fact, but none of right, for every authority, or every influence of right, officially imposed as such, becoming directly an oppression and a falsehood, would inevitably impose upon us, as I believe I have sufficiently shown, slavery and absurdity. And, that last word is going too far, but in the Islamic State, they do not force deen, They can't or they're not going to try to force your change of system of judgment, right? And slavery's not, these people don't believe right, and we go and fight them, no, and make them slaves. Muhammad said that God told him that his curse is upon those who fight to gain slaves, to force conversion, to extend borders, to gain other worldly treasures. In a word, we reject all legislation, all authority, and all privileged, licensed, official, and legal influence, even though arising from universal suffrage, convinced that it can turn only to the advantage of a dominant minority of exploiters against the interests of the immense majority in subjection to them. This is the sense in which we are really anarchists. And a true anarchist would not have any tribe, not any gang, definitely not any central government. The modern idealists understand authority in quite a different way. Although free from the traditional superstitions of all the existent positive religions, they nevertheless attach to this idea of authority a divine and absolute meaning. Well, even if a meaning is totally correct, do you really know all of the meaning? This authority is not that of a truth miraculously revealed, nor that of a truth rigorously and scientifically demonstrated. They base it to a slight extent upon quasi-philosophical reasoning, and to a large extent on vaguely religious faith, to a large extent also on sentiment, ideally, abstractly poetical. Their religion is, as it were, a last attempt to demonize all that constitutes humanity in men. This is just the opposite of the work that we are doing. In behalf of human liberty, dignity, and prosperity, we believe it our duty to recover from heaven the goods which it has stolen and return them to earth. They, on the contrary, endeavoring to commit a final, religiously heroic larceny, would restore to heaven that divine robber finally unmasks the grandest, finest, and noblest of humanity's possessions. It is now the freethinker's turn to pillage heaven by their audacious impiety and scientific analysis. The idealists undoubtedly believe that human ideas and deeds, in order to exercise greater authority among men, must be invested with a divine sanction. How is this sanction manifested? Not by a miracle, as in the positive religions, but by the very grandeur or sanctity of the ideas and deeds. Whatever is grand, whatever is beautiful, whatever is noble, whatever is just, is considered divine. In this new religious cult, every man inspired by these ideas, by these deeds, becomes a priest, directly consecrated by God himself. And the proof? He needs none beyond the very grandeur of the ideas which he expresses, and the deeds which he performs. These are so holy that they can have been inspired only by God. Now we need to distinguish the difference between inspired and motivated, provoked, you know. The word inspired and even revealed and all that sort of stuff has been secularized. Such, in few words, is their whole philosophy. A philosophy of sentiments, not of real thoughts, a sort of metaphysical pietism. This seems harmless, but it is not so at all, and the very precise, very narrow, and very barren doctrine hidden under these intangible vaguenesses of these poetic forms leads to the same disastrous results that all the positive religions lead to, namely, the most complete negation of human liberty and dignity. And when we do say no, let's focus on the idea that most things are allowed, right? Or there's a context for things if we say that a type of thing is off, right? To proclaim as divine all that is grand, just, noble, and beautiful in humanity is to tacitly admit that humanity of itself would have been unable to produce it. That is, that abandoned to itself, its own nature is miserable, iniquitous, base, and ugly. Thus we come back to the essence of all religion, in other words, to the disparagement of humanity for the greater glory of divinity. And why can't you uplift humanity glorifying deity? Because by what he says is religion, Islam doesn't have this idea. And from the moment that the natural inferiority of man and his fundamental incapacity to rise by his own effort, unaided by any divine inspiration, to the comprehension of just and true ideas are admitted, it becomes necessary to admit also all the theological, political, and social consequences of the positive religions. For the moment that God, the perfect and supreme being, is posited face to face with humanity, divine mediators, the elect, the inspired of God, spring from the earth to enlighten, direct, and govern in his name the human race. Well, we need to make it not about our ruling over other people, right? Even if that opportunity comes to us and we live out those positions. May we not suppose that all men are equally inspired by God? Then surely there is no further use for mediators. But this supposition is impossible, because it is too clearly contradicted by the facts. It would compel us to attribute to divine inspiration all the absurdities and errors which appear, and all the horrors, follies, base deeds, and cowardly actions which are committed in the world. But perhaps then only a few men are divinely inspired, the great men of history, the virtuous geniuses, and the illustrious Italian citizen and prophet Giuseppe Mazzini called them. Yeah, I don't... Are they using a phrase in calling him a prophet, or, did he actually claim to be a spiritually gifted person for the people or something? Immediately inspired by God himself and supported upon universal consent expressed by popular suffrage, Dio e Popolo, such as these should be called the government of human societies. Okay, I think they mean okay, it's a phrase. In London, I once heard M. Louis Blanc express almost the same idea. The best form of government, he said to me, would be that which would invariably call men of virtuous genius, for the control of affairs. But here we are again fallen back under the yoke of church and state.